The morning mist clung to the cathedral steps like a shroud, mirroring the heavy hearts of those who had gathered. Catherine stood at the towering oak doors, her black dress rustling softly in the autumn breeze. Beside her, William's steady presence offered the only anchor in a world that seemed to have tilted off its axis. The bells had fallen silent now, their final toll still echoing in the distance like a whispered farewell. 3 weeks had passed since the accident that changed everything. 3 weeks since the phone call that shattered their carefully constructed world. The Queen Mother, beloved by millions, had been returning from a charity visit to a children's hospital when the collision occurred. The details remained blurred in Catherine's mind, perhaps mercifully so. What mattered now was not how Eleanor had left them, but how profoundly her absence would be felt. Catherine remembered the first time she had met Eleanor, 6 years ago when William had nervously introduced his girlfriend to the royal family. The elderly woman had taken Catherine's hands in her own weathered ones, studying her face with kind but searching eyes. There had been no judgment, only warmth and an immediate acceptance that had made Catherine feel, for the first time, that she truly belonged in this extraordinary family. The crowd beyond the cathedral doors stretched as far as the eye could see. Thousands had come to pay their respects, many camping overnight to secure a place along the processional route. Flowers carpeted the streets in a rainbow of remembrance, their sweet fragrance mixing with the crisp October air. Handwritten notes fluttered from lamp posts and railings, testimonials to a life that had touched so many. William's jaw was set in that familiar way Catherine recognized from their most difficult moments. She knew he was holding himself together through sheer force of will, compartmentalizing his grief to fulfill the duties that had been drilled into him since childhood. But she could see the hairline cracks in his composure, the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of arrangements and protocols. There were guest lists to approve, security details to coordinate, and a million small decisions that somehow felt monumentally important. Catherine had thrown herself into the planning, grateful for the distraction it provided. Every flower arrangement scrutinized, every musical selection carefully chosen to honor Eleanor's memory properly. But, in the quiet moments, when the officials had gone home and the palace fell silent, the reality would crash over them like a tide. Eleanor was gone. The woman who had become Catherine's anchor in the often turbulent waters of royal life, who had offered counsel and comfort with equal measure, would never again greet them with her radiant smile and gentle embrace. Eleanor had been the bridge between the old ways and the new, helping Catherine navigate the complex traditions while encouraging her to bring her own authentic voice to her royal role. She had shared stories of her own early days in the family, the mistakes and triumphs that had shaped her understanding of duty and service. Through Eleanor, Catherine had learned that being royal did not mean sacrificing one's humanity, but rather finding ways to use one's position to lift others. The children had been their greatest concern these past weeks. Young Prince George, at 10 years old, struggled to understand why his beloved great-grandmother would not be returning from her long journey, as they had gently explained. Princess Charlotte, 8 and perceptive beyond her years, had asked difficult questions that left the adults scrambling for answers that made sense to a child's mind. Little Prince Louis, at 5, seemed to sense the sadness around him, but could not grasp its permanence. Catherine had spent countless hours with each of them, reading stories and answering questions as honestly as age would allow. She had learned from Eleanor's own approach to difficult conversations, always leading with love and never talking down to a child's intelligence. The hardest moment had been when Charlotte asked if Gongon was happy where she was now, and Catherine had to fight back tears as she assured her daughter that yes, Eleanor was at peace. The cathedral began to fill slowly, a river of black-clad mourners moving with reverent quiet. Catherine recognized many faces from state dinners and official functions, but there were others too. Charity workers Eleanor had championed, children from the school she had visited, ordinary citizens whose lives she had somehow touched. This diversity of mourners spoke to Eleanor's greatest achievement, her ability to connect with people from all walks of life. William squeezed Catherine's hand gently, a silent communication that passed between them. They had learned, over their years together, to speak without words when circumstances required it. Today would test every skill they had developed in managing public emotion while processing private grief. The nation would be watching, looking to them for cues on how to process this collective loss. The Archbishop approached them with solemn dignity, his vestments flowing like water around his tall frame. He had known Eleanor personally, had officiated at her own wedding decades earlier, and countless family celebrations since. His presence offered comfort in its continuity, a reminder that some things endured even when everything else seemed to shift. As the great doors swung open to admit the first of the official mourners, Catherine felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of Eleanor's presence. It was as if the older woman stood beside her, offering that familiar, encouraging smile. For a moment, Catherine could almost hear her voice. "Courage, dear one. Lead with your heart, and you will never go wrong." The organ's first notes filled the cathedral, a haunting melody that Eleanor had specifically requested years ago when planning this day. Even in death, she was still teaching them, showing them how to face the impossible with grace and dignity. Catherine straightened her shoulders, drew a deep breath, and prepared to say goodbye to the woman who had taught her what it truly meant to serve. The cathedral had transformed into a sea of faces, each one reflecting the profound loss that had brought them together. Catherine sat in the front pew, her children close beside her, their small hands clasped tightly in hers. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the stone floor, as if heaven itself was painting a tribute to Eleanor's colorful life. William had risen to deliver the eulogy, a task that had kept him awake for nights as he struggled to find words worthy of the woman who had shaped not just his understanding of duty, but his very conception of love. Catherine watched him walk to the lectern with measured steps, his face a mask of composed dignity that she knew masked a heart breaking into pieces. The speech he gave was unlike anything the public had heard from him before. Gone was the formal rhetoric of official occasions, replaced by something raw and deeply personal. He spoke of a grandmother who had taught him to find joy in small moments, who had shown him that true strength lay not in never falling, but in how gracefully one rose after each stumble. He shared memories that painted Eleanor not as the distant figure of state ceremonies, but as a woman who had sneaked sweets to her great-grandchildren despite their parents' nutritional rules, who had taught William to skip stones by the lake at their country estate, who had sat with Catherine during her most difficult early days in the royal family, offering wisdom wrapped in gentle humor. Catherine felt tears she had been holding back for weeks finally spill over as William described Eleanor's final weeks. Despite her age, she had maintained a schedule that would have challenged someone half her years. She had visited 3 charities, held audiences with young entrepreneurs, and had been planning a trip to support flood victims when the accident occurred. Even at 87, she had refused to slow down, driven by what she called her sacred contract with the people she served. The music that followed was hauntingly beautiful, pieces that Eleanor had personally selected years ago when she had, with characteristic practicality, planned her own memorial service. She had chosen hymns that spoke of hope rather than despair, melodies that celebrated life rather than mourning death. Even in this final act, she was teaching them how to honor loss while embracing the gift of having loved and been loved in return. As the service progressed, Catherine found herself remembering not the grand public moments of Eleanor's life, but the quiet private ones that had meant everything to their family. Eleanor reading bedtime stories to the children in different voices for each character, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Eleanor teaching Charlotte how to arrange flowers, passing down skills that had been handed down through generations of royal women. Eleanor sitting with Catherine during her pregnancy scares, holding her hand and sharing stories of her own fears and hopes as a young mother. The Archbishop spoke of Eleanor's legacy, but Catherine knew it was more than the charities she had founded or the countries she had visited. Eleanor's true legacy lived in the way she had shown them all how to be human while carrying the weight of public expectation. She had demonstrated that authenticity and duty were not opposing forces, but rather could be woven together into something stronger than either could be alone. During one particularly moving musical piece, Catherine noticed the children's reactions. George sat very straight, trying to mirror his father's composure, but occasionally wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Charlotte leaned against Catherine's shoulder, her small body occasionally shaking with quiet sobs. Louis, too young to fully understand but old enough to sense the gravity of the moment, remained unusually still, his favorite toy elephant clutched tightly in his lap. The congregation included faces from around the world, fellow royals, heads of state, celebrities, and charity workers. But what moved Catherine most were the ordinary people scattered throughout the cathedral, individuals whose lives Eleanor had touched during her countless public engagements. She recognized the woman who ran the homeless shelter Eleanor had quietly supported for decades, the teacher whose innovative program Eleanor had championed, the young man who had received one of Eleanor's educational grants and gone on to become a doctor. These people represented the true measure of Eleanor's impact. While the media would focus on the famous faces in attendance, Catherine knew Eleanor would have been most pleased by the presence of those whose lives she had quietly influenced. She had always said that real change happened not in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of small acts of kindness and support. As the service neared its conclusion, Catherine felt a profound shift in the atmosphere. What had begun as a gathering of mourners had transformed into something else, a celebration of a life well lived and a collective commitment to carry forward Eleanor's values. The grief remained, would always remain, but it was now accompanied by something that felt almost like gratitude. The final hymn was one that Eleanor had hummed while working in her garden, a simple melody that she had taught to all her great-grandchildren. As hundreds of voices joined together in song, Catherine felt Eleanor's presence once more, not as a ghost or memory, but as a living force that would continue to guide them in the years ahead. When William returned to sit beside her, Catherine saw that his composure had finally cracked slightly, tears running silently down his cheeks. She took his hand, feeling the weight of shared grief and shared responsibility. They were no longer just husband and wife, or even just parents. They were now the keepers of Eleanor's legacy, charged with interpreting her values for a new generation. The children sensed the shift in their parents' demeanor. George reached across to take his father's other hand, while Charlotte snuggled closer to Catherine. Even little Louis seemed to understand that this was a moment requiring unity. They sat together as the final notes of the hymn faded away, a family forever changed but somehow also forever strengthened by their shared loss. The procession from the cathedral moved with the slow, measured pace of collective grief made manifest. Catherine sat in the car beside William, watching through the window as thousands of people lined the streets, many throwing flowers onto the road before their vehicle. The silence inside the car was heavy but not uncomfortable. After years of marriage, they had learned to find solace in shared quiet moments. The children had been taken separately to the private family gathering that would follow the public ceremony. Catherine was grateful for this small mercy, knowing that the intensity of public grief could be overwhelming even for adults who had grown up in the public eye. George had whispered to her as they parted that he would take care of his siblings, and the maturity in his young voice had nearly undone her careful composure. Eleanor's final resting place was in the Royal Cemetery, a peaceful grove surrounded by ancient oak trees that she had personally selected decades earlier. She had often walked there during her final years, finding comfort in its quiet beauty and the presence of family members who had gone before. Catherine remembered joining her on those walks, listening as Eleanor shared stories of each person buried there, keeping their memories alive through the power of storytelling. The private burial service was intimate, attended only by close family and Eleanor's most trusted staff members. Catherine was struck by how different this gathering felt from the grand public ceremony. Here, grief could be displayed without concern for cameras or public perception. Here, they could simply be a family saying goodbye to someone they loved. William's voice broke as he read a passage that Eleanor had specifically requested, a poem about love transcending death that she had discovered during her own period of grief when her husband had passed away 15 years earlier. Catherine watched the family members around her, seeing Eleanor's influence reflected in each face. Her children had inherited her sense of duty, her grandchildren her warmth, her great-grandchildren her curiosity about the world. Eleanor's long-serving lady-in-waiting, Margaret, had been with the family for over 30 years. As they lowered the casket into the earth, Margaret stepped forward to place a single white rose on top, a gesture so simple yet so profound that it reduced many of the gathered family to tears. In that moment, Catherine realized that Eleanor's true family extended far beyond blood relations to include all those who had shared in her daily life and service. The Queen, Eleanor's daughter-in-law, and William's grandmother spoke briefly about Eleanor's role as the family's emotional anchor. Her words were carefully measured, but Catherine could hear the genuine affection beneath the formal language. Eleanor had been the one family member who could speak truth to power, who could offer gentle correction when duty began to overshadow humanity. As earth was scattered over the casket, each family member taking their turn, Catherine felt the finality of the moment settle into her bones. This was not just the end of Eleanor's life, but the end of an era. Eleanor had represented a bridge between the modern royal family and its historical traditions, someone who could honor the past while embracing necessary change. The reception that followed was held at Eleanor's favorite residence, a manor house that she had used for private retreats and informal family gatherings. The rooms were filled with photographs spanning Eleanor's long life, her wedding day, the births of her children and grandchildren, countless charity events, and state occasions. But Catherine found herself drawn to the more personal images, Eleanor gardening, reading to children, laughing with family members during holiday celebrations. Conversations flowed more naturally here, away from the formal constraints of the public ceremonies. Family members shared memories that brought Eleanor to life in the room, her laughter seeming to echo in the stories being told. Catherine learned new things about her late grandmother-in-law, small details that painted a richer picture of the woman behind the public figure. Eleanor's personal secretary approached Catherine with a sealed envelope bearing her name in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting. Inside was a letter written just weeks before Eleanor's death, filled with advice and encouragement for the challenges that lay ahead. Eleanor had written about the importance of staying true to oneself while serving others, about finding strength in vulnerability, about raising children who would understand both privilege and responsibility. The letter concluded with words that would stay with Catherine forever. "My dear, you have brought such joy to our family, not because you have learned to play a role, but because you have remained authentically yourself while growing into your responsibilities. Continue to trust your instincts, lead with your heart, and remember that the greatest service we can provide is simply to care deeply about others' well-being." William found Catherine sitting in Eleanor's private study, the letter still in her hands. Without speaking, he sat beside her and she shared Eleanor's final words with him. They sat together in the chair where Eleanor had spent countless hours, feeling her presence strongly in the room she had made her own through years of love and attention. The children rejoined them later, and together they explored Eleanor's personal rooms, touching objects that held memories and discovering keepsakes that told stories of a life fully lived. Charlotte found Eleanor's jewelry box, still containing the simple pearl earrings she had worn almost daily, while George discovered her collection of books about history and politics, margins filled with her thoughtful notes. Little Louis gravitated toward Eleanor's desk, where she had kept a small collection of toys for visiting great-grandchildren. Finding his favorite puzzle still there, exactly where Eleanor had left it after his last visit, he settled onto the floor and began working on it with the intense concentration of a child processing complex emotions through familiar activities. As evening approached and family members began to depart, Catherine and William lingered with their children in Eleanor's garden. The autumn flowers were still blooming, a testament to Eleanor's careful planning and her belief in the importance of beauty in daily life. Charlotte picked a small bouquet, wanting to take something living back to their own home. Walking through the garden paths that Eleanor had designed and tended for decades, Catherine felt a profound sense of continuity. Eleanor's physical presence was gone, but her influence would continue to shape their family for generations to come. The values she had instilled, the traditions she had honored while allowing for growth and change, the simple acts of kindness she had modeled daily, these would live on. The drive home was quiet, the children exhausted by the emotional weight of the day. Catherine watched the countryside pass by the car window, thinking about the conversations she would never again have with Eleanor, the advice she would have to navigate without her gentle guidance. But she also thought about the foundation Eleanor had provided, the confidence she had instilled, and the love that would continue to support them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The weeks following Eleanor's burial brought an unexpected challenge, learning how to continue living when the world expected them to resume normal activities almost immediately. Catherine found herself struggling with the peculiar nature of royal grief, how to process profound personal loss while maintaining public appearances and fulfilling official duties that could not be postponed indefinitely. William threw himself into work with an intensity that worried Catherine. He accepted every official engagement, traveled to opening ceremonies and charity functions with mechanical precision, and spoke about Eleanor's legacy with eloquent professionalism. But at home, in the quiet moments between public appearances, Catherine saw him struggling with emotions he felt unable to fully express. The children's reactions evolved as the reality of Eleanor's absence settled into their daily routines. George asked thoughtful questions about death and memory, processing his loss through the intellectual curiosity that Eleanor had always encouraged. Charlotte became more clingy, wanting constant reassurance that other family members were safe and healthy. Louis simply asked repeatedly when Gon was coming to visit again, unable to grasp the permanence of her absence. Catherine found unexpected comfort in continuing some of Eleanor's traditions. She began visiting the charities that Eleanor had supported, not in any official capacity, but simply as a way of maintaining connection with causes that had mattered to someone she loved. The staff at these organizations welcomed her warmly, sharing stories of Eleanor's visits and the personal touch she had brought to even the most formal occasions. At the children's hospital that had been Eleanor's favorite charity, Catherine met Dr. Sarah Chun, a pediatric oncologist who had worked closely with Eleanor for over a decade. Dr. Chun shared how Eleanor had visited sick children not just during organized events, but often privately, bringing small gifts and spending time reading stories or simply listening to young patients talk about their fears and hopes. These visits had never been publicized, Dr. Chun explained. Eleanor had insisted that her presence not become a media spectacle that might overshadow the children's needs. She had simply shown up, week after week, year after year, becoming a familiar and beloved figure to children facing the most difficult challenges of their young lives. Catherine began making similar quiet visits, following Eleanor's example of service without fanfare. She found that these private moments of connection helped her process her own grief while honoring Eleanor's memory in a meaningful way. The children she met reminded her of what Eleanor had always emphasized, that individual acts of kindness mattered more than grand gestures or public recognition. At home, Catherine discovered Eleanor's private journals, left to her in a codicil to the will that had been read weeks after the funeral. The journals spanning 60 years revealed a woman who had struggled with the same questions that Catherine faced: how to balance personal needs with public duty, how to raise children who understood privilege as responsibility rather than entitlement, how to maintain authentic relationships when so many interactions were shaped by protocol and position. Reading Eleanor's private thoughts from her early years in the royal family, Catherine found remarkable similarities to her own experiences. Eleanor had written about feeling overwhelmed by expectations, about missing the simplicity of her pre-royal life, about fears that she wasn't sophisticated enough or properly prepared for the role she had married into. But the journals also chronicled Eleanor's growth, her developing confidence, and her discovery of ways to use her position for meaningful service. One journal entry, written during Eleanor's 5th year in the royal family, particularly resonated with Catherine. "I am learning that authenticity and duty are not opposing forces. The most effective service comes not from perfect adherence to protocol, but from bringing one's genuine care for others into every interaction. People respond to sincerity, not performance." William gradually began to open up about his own struggles with Eleanor's death. During a quiet evening together, he admitted that he felt pressure to be the family's emotional leader when he was still processing his own loss. Eleanor had been his confidant during difficult periods, the family member who could offer perspective without judgment. Without her guidance, he felt uncertain about decisions that once seemed clear. Catherine shared Eleanor's journals with William, and together they read passages that offered insight into how Eleanor had navigated similar challenges. They began having conversations about how to honor Eleanor's memory not through perfect continuation of her work, but through adaptation of her values to their own circumstances and personalities. The Queen requested a private meeting with Catherine, their first substantial conversation since Eleanor's death. In her private sitting room, surrounded by photographs spanning decades of royal family life, the Queen spoke more openly than Catherine had ever heard her speak about family matters. The Queen revealed that Eleanor had often served as an informal advisor during difficult family situations, someone whose judgment could be trusted completely because her motivations were never personal or political. Eleanor's ability to see situations clearly and offer wise counsel would be deeply missed, not just personally but institutionally. More surprisingly, the Queen asked Catherine if she would consider taking on some of Eleanor's patronages, not immediately, but as she felt ready to expand her own charitable work. The request was both an honor and a responsibility that Catherine knew would require careful consideration. She would need to determine which causes aligned with her own passions while respecting the relationships Eleanor had built over decades. Catherine's parents visited during this period, offering practical support with the children and emotional support for Catherine and William. Her mother, in particular, helped Catherine understand that grief was not a problem to be solved, but a process to be lived through. The expectation that they should move on after a few weeks was unrealistic and unhealthy. The children began to find their own ways of remembering Eleanor. George started a scrapbook of newspaper articles about her charitable work, wanting to understand the full scope of her contributions to society. Charlotte planted flowers in their garden that reminded her of Eleanor's favorite varieties. Louis carried Eleanor's photograph with him, talking to it about his day before bedtime. These individual approaches to memory and grief reminded Catherine that there was no single correct way to process loss. Each family member would find their own path to healing while remaining connected to the love they had shared with Eleanor. The goal was not to get over their grief, but to integrate it into their ongoing lives in a way that honored both Eleanor's memory and their own need to continue growing. And serving 6 months after Eleanor's death, Catherine stood in the same children's hospital where she had first learned about Eleanor's private charitable work. But today was different. She was here for the official opening of the Eleanor Memorial Garden, a healing space designed for young patients and their families. The project had been proposed, planned, and funded in record time, a testament to how deeply Eleanor had been loved by those who knew her work best. The garden was exactly what Eleanor would have wanted, practical rather than grand, designed for use rather than display. There were quiet corners where parents could find a moment of peace, play areas where children could forget their circumstances for a while, and reading nooks where volunteers could share stories with young patients. Catherine had been intimately involved in the design process, drawing on memories of gardens Eleanor had created and loved. William spoke at the opening ceremony, his words carrying more warmth and personal connection than they had in the immediate aftermath of Eleanor's death. He talked about how Eleanor had taught their family that true service meant paying attention to details others might overlook, ensuring there were comfortable chairs for elderly visitors, providing activities that could engage children of different ages and abilities, creating spaces that felt welcoming rather than institutional. The children had contributed to the garden in their own ways. George had researched which plants would bloom at different times of year, ensuring that there would always be color and life in the space. Charlotte had helped choose the benches and outdoor furniture, testing each piece to make sure it would be comfortable for people spending long hours at the hospital. Even Louis had participated, selecting the stepping stones for the garden paths because he liked their smooth, tactile surfaces. Dr. Chun gave Catherine a tour of the garden after the ceremony, pointing out features that had been specifically requested by the medical staff. There were hand-washing stations designed to look like water features, spaces that could accommodate wheelchairs and medical equipment without feeling clinical, and areas where medical discussions could happen privately while still maintaining visual connection to children at play. One section of the garden was dedicated to memory and reflection. Families could plant small flowers or leave stones painted with messages of hope. Eleanor would have understood the importance of acknowledging difficult emotions rather than ignoring them, Catherine reflected. She had never believed in false cheerfulness when genuine comfort was what people needed. The media coverage of the garden opening was extensive, but Catherine noticed a different tone in the reporting than she had experienced in earlier years. The focus was less on fashion choices or royal protocol, and more on the substance of the charitable work being honored. Perhaps Eleanor's death had reminded everyone, media and public alike, of what truly mattered in royal service. Back at home, Catherine and William had made changes that reflected their evolving understanding of their roles and responsibilities. They had restructured their staff to include more informal advisors who could provide perspective on community needs and charitable effectiveness. They had also created new family traditions that honored Eleanor while allowing the children to develop their own relationships with service and responsibility. Sunday dinners now included conversations about each family member's week, with particular attention to moments when they had helped others or learned something new. Eleanor had believed that awareness of service opportunities began with awareness of others' needs, and she had modeled this attention in every interaction Catherine had witnessed. The children's education had been modified to include more hands-on charitable work, age-appropriate volunteer activities that connected them with people from different backgrounds and circumstances. Eleanor had always insisted that empathy could not be taught through books alone, but required genuine interaction with diverse communities. Catherine found herself thinking differently about her public appearances and official duties. Instead of focusing primarily on what was expected of her, she began asking what unique contributions she could make based on her own interests and experiences. Eleanor had shown her that the most effective royal service came from authentic engagement rather than dutiful performance. The letters that continued to arrive from the public showed how profoundly Eleanor's death had affected people who had never met her personally. Many shared stories of brief encounters. Eleanor stopping to talk with a child during a walkabout. Eleanor remembering a charity worker's name from a previous visit. Eleanor taking extra time to listen when someone shared a personal concern. These stories revealed the cumulative impact of Eleanor's approach to her role. She had understood that royal influence came not from grand gestures, but from consistent demonstration of care and attention. Every interaction had been an opportunity to model the values she hoped to see in the world: kindness, curiosity, respect for others regardless of their circumstances. William received a letter from his father, the king, acknowledging the growth and maturity that both Catherine and William had shown in the months since Eleanor's death. The king wrote about his own experience of loss and the way grief had ultimately deepened his understanding of his responsibilities. Eleanor's death, while devastating personally, had also clarified their shared commitment to service that made a real difference in people's lives. The anniversary of Eleanor's death approached with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. The family planned to mark the day privately, visiting Eleanor's grave and sharing memories of her impact on their lives. But they also planned to announce new charitable initiatives that built on Eleanor's work while reflecting their own evolving interests and capabilities. Catherine had decided to focus particularly on supporting families dealing with grief and loss, drawing on her own recent experiences to understand what kinds of support were most helpful during difficult times. She wanted to create resources and programs that acknowledged the complexity of grief while providing practical assistance for those navigating loss. Standing in the memorial garden as the sun set on opening day, Catherine felt Eleanor's presence not as an absence to be grieved, but as a foundation upon which to build. The values Eleanor had modeled, the relationships she had nurtured, the standards of service she had maintained, these would continue to guide their family's work for generations to come. The children ran through the garden paths, their laughter mixing with the sounds of families using the space as it had been intended. Catherine watched them play and thought about the world they would inherit, the challenges they would face, and the example Eleanor had provided for meeting those challenges with grace, determination, and unwavering commitment to the well-being of others. As they prepared to leave, Charlotte took Catherine's hand and asked if Eleanor would have liked the garden. Catherine knelt down to her daughter's level and smiled, remembering Eleanor's voice and the words she would have used. Darling, she would have loved it not because it's beautiful, but because it will help people feel better when they need it most. And in that moment, Catherine knew they had found their way forward, not past their grief, but through it, toward a future that honored Eleanor's memory through continued service and love.